The candle had burned to its last quarter-inch when Cecily Vane pressed the folded contract to the flame. She did not do it in anger. That was what no one would have believed had anyone been watching from the corridor. There was no wild motion, no slammed bureau, no bitten-back cry. She held the document over the candle's crown with the same deliberateness she brought to everything, and she watched the corner catch, and then the edge, and then the whole of the first page blacken and curl, as though the paper itself were relieved to be released from what it named. The fire in the grate had settled to embers. Outside, the November wind came off the fields in long, low pulls that made the window frames shiver in their casings. She was alone. She had been alone since 10:30, when her maid had withdrawn. And the house had gone quiet in that particular way that large houses do when every occupant understands that something significant has occurred without anyone having named it aloud. The marriage contract burned for less than a minute. She set the ash in the grate and straightened. She was 23 years old, the only daughter of a solicitor dead these 4 months, and she had been a wife for 11 hours. She did not feel like a wife. She felt the way she had felt at the reading of her father's will, when the solicitor had lowered his spectacles and said the words she had already known were coming. And there had been a kind of slow clarity in hearing what she had already understood, that the world she had lived in no longer existed, and she would have to build a new one from what remained. The contract was gone. The marriage was not. That was the particular difficulty. If anyone had thought to ask Cecily Vane who she was in those weeks before the ceremony, they would have received a precise answer and no sentiment. She was the daughter of Mr. George Vane, late of Lincoln's Inn, a man who had spent 30 years doing honest work for dishonest fees, and who had left behind a reputation for integrity that his creditors were now busy dismantling. She had kept his household for 7 years, managed his correspondence, read his contracts over his shoulder until she could parse an entail clause with as much authority as any junior solicitor. And when he died, in July, she had stood at the graveside in her plain black gown, with the expression of a woman who intends to continue, because there was nothing else to do. The house on Cavendish Row was not hers. That had been the first surprise, though in retrospect it should not have been. Her father had borrowed against it 6 years before, the loan held by a Mr. Dunmore, a creditor who had outlived her father's ability to repay him, and who was now represented by his son, Mr. Frederick Dunmore, a man of 29 with excellent manners and a face like an interior room that had been closed up for the season. Frederick Dunmore had appeared at the house 3 weeks after the funeral. He had accepted tea. He had expressed his condolences in the manner of a man reading from a prepared text. And then he had explained, with careful courtesy, that the note was called "The House Would Be Sold," and that there was, however, one alternative arrangement his family was prepared to consider. She had looked at him for a long moment. He had looked at the window. "My mother," he said, "believes you to be a practical woman." She had met his mother precisely once. Lady Dunmore, a widow who kept a house in Brook Street and who attended every social occasion of consequence in the autumn season, with the quiet authority of someone who has decided the social order exists to be managed rather than enjoyed. Lady Dunmore had looked at Cecily at the Partington Musicale 3 weeks before her father's death and had said, within Cecily's hearing, that it was a pity about the Vane girl. Clever enough, but with no prospects worth mentioning. Cecily had not forgotten the word pity. She had filed it in the same interior drawer where she kept all the things the season said about her when it thought she was not attending. "A practical woman," Cecily repeated. "The house," Frederick said, "would pass to you upon our marriage The debt would be settled. You would be established. He said it the way one might describe a parcel being forwarded, something moved from one address to another with minimal difficulty. She had thought about it for 3 days, or she had sat with her father's account books and his remaining correspondence and the increasingly pointed letters from his other creditors, and she had looked at the sum that remained and the sum that was owed, and she had arrived at a number that would not resolve without assistance. She had no relations who could provide that assistance. She had no suitor who had arrived before the debt did. She had the house, which was not hers, and a mind that her father had spent considerable effort sharpening, and the specific kind of calm that comes from having watched a beloved parent die with insufficient pain relief over a period of 6 weeks. She had written to Frederick Dunmore and accepted. Lady Dunmore had received this news with a satisfaction she did not quite conceal. The announcement was made. The contract was drawn. Cecily had read every clause of it twice, which had surprised Frederick, and 3 times, which had surprised him further. And she had signed where she was directed to sign with a hand that did not shake, because shaking was not useful. The wedding was quiet. The church was cold. She wore her mother's altered gown, which was cream rather than white, and the fit was not quite right across the shoulders. And she had been aware of this imprecision all through the ceremony, with the steady, low attention she brought to problems she could not presently solve. Frederick said his vows in a voice that was audible, but not warm. She said hers in a voice she did not recognize. The wedding breakfast had been arranged by Lady Dunmore and held in the Brook Street house, and it was at the wedding breakfast that Cecily first understood the thing she had not understood when she agreed. She had been seated at the far end of the table from Frederick, beside his Aunt Mrs. Hurst, a woman whose primary conversational mode was sympathetic condescension, and across from Miss Arabella Fitch, a girl of 21 who had apparently attended the ceremony as a friend of the family, and who had apparently been Frederick Dunmore's particular friend for the better part of 2 years, and who apparently had not, until 4 weeks ago, understood that the friendship would not result in an engagement. Cecily had not been told this. She did not suppose she had been meant to know it. Miss Fitch had looked at Cecily with an expression that was not quite sorrow and not quite hatred, but occupied the uncomfortable space between them, and had said nothing aloud, but had leaned toward Mrs. Hurst at the third remove and said in a voice pitched just above the ambient conversation, "I suppose she will suit him well enough. I am told she is very competent." Cecily had continued eating. The word competent sat where pity had sat before it, in the same interior drawer, which was beginning to require more room. Frederick had not looked at his new wife during the wedding breakfast with any frequency that might be characterized as ardent. He had looked at Miss Fitch twice, and at the window once, and at his wine glass a number of times that Cecily did not count, but registered. She was competent. She had always been competent. Competent was the word the world used for women who did not have the resources to be beautiful and charming and were therefore required to be useful. The guests had departed by 9. Lady Dunmore had kissed her on the cheek with a warmth that arrived a moment too late to be convincing. Frederick had escorted her to the house on Cavendish Row, which was hers now by the terms of the contract, and had sat with her in the drawing room for an hour, during which the conversation had been civil and without content. 2 people describing the surface of their days to each other. And then he had said he had correspondence to attend to, and she had said good night, and he had gone to the study, and she had gone upstairs. Her maid had helped her out of the ceremony gown and hung it with more ceremony than Cecily herself could presently summon. And then Cecily had been alone, and the contract had been on the writing table where she had placed it when it arrived in the week before the wedding, and she had picked it up and read it again. It was, she had to concede, a precise document. It named the house. It named the debt. It named the settlement that would come to her in the event of Frederick's death, and the settlement that would not. It named the terms of the arrangement with the clarity of a man who had grown up in a household that treated everything as an arrangement. She had read it 3 times. Then she had held it over the candle. If you have ever held a thing you cannot keep, you understand that the burning is not destruction. It is a different kind of keeping. She slept after, in a sleep that was quiet and without dreaming, and she woke at 7:30 to the particular grey November light of London and the sound of the household beginning its day below, and she dressed without her maid because she preferred mornings to herself, and she went downstairs and found, as she had suspected she would find, that Frederick had already breakfasted and gone out. She ate toast and drank her tea and sat with the Morning Post. There was a letter from her father's former clerk, with a question about an outstanding file she would need to resolve. There was a card from Mrs. Hurst. There was nothing from her husband. She was not surprised. She was beginning to understand the shape of the thing she had entered, the way one understands a room by moving through it in the dark, one hand along the wall. The shape of it was simple. She had been acquired, not chosen. She had solved a problem that Frederick's circumstances had presented, which was the need for a wife of sufficient station and minimal complication, and he had solved a problem that her circumstances had presented, which was the need for a house and the dissolution of a debt. Neither of them had been deceived about the nature of the transaction. She had simply not understood, until the wedding breakfast, what the transaction had cost him, and what it would therefore cost her. She could be competent. She had always been competent. She was not certain she could bear to be only competent in this house for the rest of her life. If anyone had thought to ask Cecily's opinion of her situation in those first weeks, she would not have offered it, because nobody had thought to ask. Lady Dunmore called twice in the first fortnight and spoke to her for a combined total of 3/4 of an hour about the management of the Cavendish Row household, the importance of maintaining an appropriate social calendar, and the expectations her son had for domestic life, all in the brisk register of someone issuing instructions to a housekeeper. Frederick was present at dinner most evenings, absent at breakfast, and civil at all times in the particular way that civility can be deployed as a distance. In the 3rd week, she found the music. She had gone into the small sitting room off the drawing room, which she had been told was used for correspondence, and had discovered that it was also used, or had been used, for a pianoforte that sat against the wall beneath a linen cover, which had not been removed in some time, given the dust along its edges. She had lifted the cover, out of habit, and found the keys, and had sat down without thinking, and had played the first thing that came to her hands, which was a piece her father had liked. She had been playing for perhaps 10 minutes when she became aware that she was not alone. Frederick was in the doorway. He was not in the posture of someone who has been there a long time, but in the posture of someone who arrived recently and stopped before he could decide what to do next. He was looking at her with the expression she had come to associate with him when he thought he was not observed, which was the expression of a man who is present somewhere he did not expect to find himself. She stopped playing. "I did not know you played," he said. "I did not know you had a pianoforte," she said. A pause, which was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. "It was my sister's," he said. She had not known he had a sister. This was the first piece of information he had volunteered about himself that was not procedural in nature. She waited. He said nothing further. She looked at the keys. "She died," he said. 4 years ago. Fever. The information landed with the particular weight of things said aloud for the first time. She looked at him. He had turned slightly away from her, as though the doorway itself were something to manage. "I am sorry," she said. She said it in the plain way, without the ornament of condolence, because he did not seem to be a man who received ornament well. He nodded, once, and left. She did not play again that day. She did not cover the pianoforte. There is a particular education available to a woman who watches carefully and says little. Cecily had been enrolled in it for 23 years and had emerged with a curriculum no academy had formally offered her. What she learned, over the following weeks, was that Frederick Dunmore was not the man she had understood him to be at their introduction. Or rather, he was that man, and he was also something else. Something that the arrangement they had entered had not required him to show her, and that he therefore had not. He was capable of sitting in the same room with her for an hour and reading without acknowledging her, which she had initially understood as indifference, and which she now suspected was simply the habit of a man who had lived alone with his thoughts for a long time. He asked twice for her opinion on matters regarding the household accounts, and when she gave it, he attended to it, which was not what she had expected. He did not tell her what she ought to think. He did not condescend to her intelligence. He was not warm, but warmth, she was beginning to understand, was not the only coin in circulation. The question of Miss Fitch resolved itself in the 4th week, when Lady Dunmore mentioned, in a tone of settled satisfaction, that Miss Fitch had gone to stay with relations in Bath. Cecily registered this information without comment. Lady Dunmore looked at her with an expression that Cecily could not quite read, something between approval and inquiry, and moved on. And she was learning to read him. She did not think he was learning to read her. It was a Thursday evening in December, 3 weeks after the visit from Lady Dunmore, that the thing she could not have anticipated happened. She had been in the library, reading, when Frederick came in without announcement. He was in his coat, which meant he had just returned from somewhere, and he had a letter in his hand. And he was not wearing the expression of a man returning from an ordinary engagement. He stood in the center of the room and said nothing. She looked up. "My mother," he said, "has sent me your wedding contract." She kept her expression level. The original copy, the solicitor's retained copy, which she had not burned. The document she had signed. The document she had burned had been her own copy, the one she had been given to keep. "She has enclosed a note," he said, "in which she informs me that she believes the terms to be unsatisfactory, and that she intends to have the matter reviewed." Cecily said nothing, because she was thinking. "She is particularly concerned," he said slowly, "with the clause regarding your independent settlement." She had negotiated that clause herself, quietly, by inserting 2 sentences into the draft that had been returned to her for review, sentences that gave her a degree of independence that was unusual and that she had not expected to survive the solicitor's counter-review, but that had, in the confusion of the final days before the wedding, passed unnoticed. She had not told Frederick about them. She had assumed he had read the contract. He had apparently not read the contract. She considered whether to apologize. She decided against it. "I read the contract," she said, "before I signed it, as one does." He looked at her for a moment that held a quality she had not seen in him before, something that was not quite respect and not quite surprise, but occupied the same space as both. "My mother says you are very clever," he said. "Your mother says I am competent," she said, "which is what is said of women who are permitted to be useful, but not to be considered." The silence that followed was of a different quality from the silences she had grown accustomed to in this house. It had more weight. He set the letter on the library table and sat down in the chair across from hers, which he had not done before in all the weeks she had been here. "You burned your copy of the contract," he said. It was not a question. She did not answer. "The ink on the settlement clause was smudged in the retained copy," he said. "The solicitor mentioned it. He said you must have pressed too hard. The smudge is on the original, not on a copy. You read it, and you burned it. And whatever was in it that you had negotiated, you knew it was already in the retained document." He paused. "You were not destroying the marriage. You were destroying the evidence of what you had done." She looked at him. "You are telling me," she said, "that you know I arranged for my own protection without informing you." "I am telling you," he said, "that I should have read it." She had not expected that. He looked at the window, and then at his hands, and then at her. "I was not," he said carefully, "in an uncomplicated situation when we married. I was in a situation my mother had managed, which is not the same thing as a situation I had managed. I knew what the arrangement was. I did not think about what it was for you. The fire was low. The room was warm. She had spent 4 months being very careful about the exact amount of space she occupied in rooms where she was uncertain of her welcome, and she was tired, suddenly, of the carefulness. What it was for me, she said, was a house and a settled debt, and the particular experience of understanding that the man who had agreed to it could not quite bring himself to look at me at our own wedding breakfast. He absorbed this. "I was looking at a mistake I had made," he said, "not at a deficiency in you." She studied his face. He was not comfortable. He was not retreating into the careful civil register he had deployed for 4 weeks. He was sitting in the discomfort the way someone sits in a room they have avoided because it contains something they have not resolved, and he was looking at her with the specific attention of a man who is discovering that someone he had estimated imprecisely is rather different from the estimate. "You cannot review the settlement clause," she said. "It is in the retained document, which is legally binding. Whatever your mother intends." "I know," he said. "I am not here to review it." A pause. "Then what are you here for?" she said. He looked at her hands on the book, and then at her face, and then, with an effort, she could see in the set of his jaw, directly at her eyes. "I do not know," he said. "I have been in this library for 30 years. And I have never sat in that chair. I came in because I was angry at my mother. And I stayed because I'm not certain I have spoken to anyone in this house as a person, rather than as a circumstance. And you are the first person in this house who has behaved as though you expected to be treated as a person, and I have been rude enough to you for long enough that I thought I should say so." She considered him. "That is not an apology," she said. "No," he said. "I do not know how to make one properly. My sister used to say I was the worst person she had ever met at the specific business of saying I was sorry." The sister's name arrived in the room. He looked, briefly, as though he had not intended to open that door. "Eleanor," she said, looking at the pianoforte just visible through the connecting door, and his face changed in the way faces change when the right word lands in an unexpected place. "Eleanor," he said. There was something between them, then, that had not been there before. It was not warmth, precisely. Not yet. And it was not understanding. Not yet. But it was the beginning of a space in which those things might one day occur. A door not quite open. Light at its edges. She thought of the contract. The ash was still in the grate. She had not cleaned it out. "I burned it," she said, "because I was angry." "I know," he said. "I was angry because I had made a rational decision, and I had not been angry about it until I sat at our wedding breakfast and understood that I had been acquired, not chosen, and that no one had intended to deceive me. Everyone had simply not troubled to consider the difference." He was silent for a moment, that had the quality of genuine reception rather than strategic management. "That is a meaningful distinction," he said. "It is the only distinction that matters." Another silence. Longer. She had said more to him in 10 minutes than in 4 weeks, and she was not certain whether this had happened because she was tired or because something in the room had shifted. The letter on the table, the mention of his sister, the angle of the winter light through the library windows, some combination she could not quite name. "My mother will not prevail in the review," she said. "The clause is sound." "I know," he said again. And then, after a moment, he said, "I should not like her to try." She looked at him. He met her gaze. "I should not like," he said more carefully, "for this to be the kind of arrangement it has been. I do not know how to make it otherwise. I have been alone a long time, and I am not suited to company in the way some men are. I am not opposed to it. I was opposed to what my mother arranged without telling me the full truth of it. I am not opposed to you." It was not a declaration. It was something smaller, and she thought, something more honest. The kind of statement that a man makes when he has stopped performing the version of himself that manages things and has begun, however cautiously, to mean what he says. She looked at the window, and the dark that pressed against the glass, and the faint reflection of the library and the two of them in it. And then she looked at him. "I should like," she said, "to play the pianoforte in the evenings." A pause. "Yes," he said. "And I should like to be consulted about the household accounts." "You already are," he said. "And I should like you to read your own contracts before you sign them." Something happened at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile. It was so brief she might have invented it. "That is a fair request," he said. She turned back to her book. He did not leave. He picked up the volume on the table beside him, the one she had placed there the previous Tuesday and not yet returned to the shelf, and he opened it, and he read. They sat like that for an hour, and the fire burned lower, and neither of them said anything, and it was the most at home she had felt since July. If you have wondered what it means to choose a person rather than acquire them, the answer is that it happens quietly, and in steps too small to name at the time, and that you understand it has happened only when you look back and cannot identify the exact moment. She could not play the pianoforte the next evening because Lady Dunmore called, unannounced, in the way that only women entirely certain of their welcome ever do, and she arrived with the letter still in her hand and an expression of calm authority that had carried her through 30 years of managing the world around her to her own satisfaction. Frederick met her in the drawing room. Cecily was already there, having heard the carriage. Lady Dunmore looked at Cecily with the expression Cecily had filed away from the Partington musical, and then at Frederick. And then she placed the letter on the table and said that she had spoken with the solicitor and that the settlement clause was unorthodox, and she believed it could be challenged. Frederick said, "No." A single word, level, in the voice Cecily had heard him use only once before, when a footman had tracked mud across the hall carpet. And Frederick had simply said, "No," and the footman had understood without further explanation. Lady Dunmore said that she had not intended it as a request for his opinion. Frederick said, "It is not my opinion. It is the law," which Cecily read correctly, which I did not read closely enough. and which is, in any case, not to be challenged. Because there is nothing to challenge. Lady Dunmore looked at Cecily with an expression in which calculation was briefly visible before it was covered over with composure. "I see," she said. "She has your ear." "She has my attention," Frederick said. "Which is not the same thing, and which I should have given her from the beginning." Lady Dunmore straightened. She was a woman whose composure was genuine, not performed, and she did not fragment under this. She reset, the way a person resets when a plan encounters a variable they had not accounted for, and they are too experienced to pretend otherwise. She looked at Cecily and said, in a voice that was newly calibrated, "You are more competent than I credited." "I am more than competent," Cecily said, quietly, without heat. The word returned to the person who had first deployed it, altered now, wrested from its condescending context and placed in the category where it belonged, as a partial truth that had mistaken itself for a complete one. Lady Dunmore absorbed this. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said to Frederick, "I should like to stay for tea." He looked at Cecily. Cecily said, "Of course." It was not forgiveness. It was not even the beginning of forgiveness. It was the recognition that some people can only be educated from the inside of a situation, and that the education had begun. In the weeks that followed, something gradual occurred in the house on Cavendish Row. Not a transformation, not a dramatic reversal, nothing that could be pointed to on a calendar as a before and an after. More like the way a room looks different in December light than November light. The same room, the same furniture, but the quality of what falls through the windows has shifted, and the room reveals itself differently. Frederick asked her opinion on more things. She offered it more directly. He was startled by her sometimes, in the way of a person encountering a landscape they had assumed was flat and finding unexpected depth. And she found that she did not mind startling him. He had a dry, subterranean humor that emerged rarely and only when he had stopped managing the surface of his thoughts, and the first time it surfaced, she laughed genuinely, and the sound surprised them both. She played the pianoforte in the evenings. He read in the chair across from the small sitting-room door, within earshot. On the fourth occasion, he came and stood in the doorway, and on the fifth, he sat in the small chair beside the instrument. And on the seventh, he said, "That is the piece Eleanor played at Christmas." And she had moved, without thinking, slightly closer to him on the bench, and he had not moved away. She had been thinking about the ash in the grate. One morning in January, she cleaned it herself, which her maid offered to do, and she declined. And she sat for a moment with the small gray residue of the document she had burned, and she thought about what she had meant to do and what had happened instead. She had burned the contract because she was angry and because she wanted to burn the specific version of herself that the contract had codified. The acquired woman, the settled debt, the practical arrangement. She had not been able to burn the marriage. She had not, she was now willing to admit, wanted to. She had wanted, instead, to burn the thing that stood between what the marriage was and what it might become. And she had not known, when she held the contract to the candle, that the burning would not end at the paper's edge, but continue forward, quietly, into every conversation they had not yet had, and every evening they had not yet shared. The drawing room, the following evening, held a fire that had been laid properly for the first time in weeks, because she had shown the housemaid where to put the kindling so it drew correctly. And the room was warm, and the winter outside pressed cold against the glass, and Frederick sat across from her with his book, and she sat with hers, and neither of them was performing civility. They were simply there. He looked up. She looked up. "Cecily," he said. Her given name, used deliberately, which he had not done before in this specific way, in the particular tone of someone who has decided to close a distance rather than maintain it. She waited. "I should like to know you," he said. "Properly. I have been sharing a house with you for 2 months, and I have spent most of it managing the problem of what we are to each other when I might have spent it finding out." She considered this. "That is a reasonable thing to want," she said. "I was not a reasonable man before you arrived," he said. "I was a man who had stopped noticing the rooms he moved through because he had stopped expecting them to contain anything worth noticing." It was the closest he had come to saying what she had understood for several weeks. She set down her book. He set down his. "Eleanor liked to play in the evenings," he said. "When she was here, the house was different. When she was not here, I did not know how to make it be different again. I let my mother manage things because management did not require feeling anything, and I agreed to an arrangement that I thought would continue the management. And I did not stop to consider that the woman I was agreeing it with was a person who might have feelings about the arrangement, because I had grown very practiced at not thinking about feelings." She looked at him for a long time. "She died very fast," he said. "Eleanor. 3 days between the fever and the end. I was at my club. I did not know until the second day, because no one thought to send immediately." He stopped. "I have thought about the second day a great deal." She understood what she was being given. Not an apology. Not a declaration. Something more precise. The wound. Named. Offered across a room to someone he was slowly beginning to trust with it. She said, "My father died in 6 weeks. I was there for all 6. I used to think the length was a mercy. Now I think the length was simply the length. And whether it is 3 days or 6 weeks, the part that you return to is always the moment you did not know yet. Before you knew. When it was still possible to not know." He was looking at her. "Yes," he said quietly. "That is exactly it." The fire settled. The house was quiet. She thought of her father's will, and the reading of it, and the slow clarity of hearing what she had already known. She thought of the contract, and the flame, and the ash. She thought of Eleanor's pianoforte with its linen cover. She thought of the way December light is different from November light. She was not the woman who had arrived at this house in her mother's altered gown. She was not yet the woman she would be. She was somewhere in between, which is where all becoming occurs. He said, "I should like to be chosen by someone, rather than agreed to." The sentence arrived in the room and settled there. She said, "I should like the same." He rose from his chair. He crossed to the fireplace and stood beside it. Not beside her, which was the appropriate distance given what they still were to each other. And he looked at the fire for a moment, and then at her. "Then perhaps," he said, "we might begin." She felt something ease in her chest that had been present since July. She reached for her book. Not to read it, but to set it properly on the table beside her. A small finality. The gesture of someone who has decided that a conversation matters more than its alternative. "I should like that," she said. There was nothing dramatic in what followed. No grand gesture in a crowded room, no audience to witness the reversal of a public verdict. Only 2 people in a drawing room in January. The fire doing its work between them, the winter doing its work outside, and the long, careful, patient process of choosing someone beginning in the plainest possible way. She played the pianoforte that evening, and he sat beside her, and when she came to the piece her father had liked, she played it all the way through, which she had not done since his death, and she did not stop at the hard bar in the second movement, but continued and finished, and let the last note stand for a moment in the quiet. By spring, the house had become something different from what it had been. He called her Cecily. She called him Frederick. Lady Dunmore came to dinner and sat at the far end of the table and consumed the meal with the expression of a woman revising a plan she had thought was finished, and Cecily met her eyes across the soup and did not look away first. And Lady Dunmore, eventually, looked at her plate. By May, when the chestnuts in the park were in flower and the season had begun in earnest, Cecily Dunmore walked into the first ball of the year on the arm of her husband, and the room observed them with the particular interest reserved for couples whose arrangement had been understood to be a transaction and who were now demonstrating, in the small specific ways that cannot be performed, that it had become something else. He kept her hand on his arm. She did not look around the room for permission to be present. He introduced her to a man she had not previously met, and in the introduction, he said her name the way he had begun to say it, the way you say the name of something you have learned to value. Miss Arabella Fitch had returned from Bath and was present at the ball in ice blue silk, and she observed Frederick Dunmore watching his wife with the careful attention of someone discovering that what they believed to be a predictable man contained depths they had not perceived. And the observation cost her something she could not quite name. The pianoforte had been uncovered, permanently, 3 months ago. The linen cloth had been washed and put away. She did not tell anyone what she had burned on her wedding night, because it was not the sort of thing one tells. The ash was long since gone from the grate. The contract was in the solicitor's office, legal and binding, the settlement clause in place. What she had burned was not the contract. She had known that by morning. What she had burned was the version of the story in which she was only acquired, only managed, only competent. The version in which she moved through a life decided for her by numbers that did not balance, and a debt that was not of her making. She had held that version to the flame, deliberately, in the calm, particular way she brought to everything, and she had watched it blacken and curl, and she had set the ash in the grate, and straightened, and she had gone to sleep. The story she was living was different. She had negotiated the clause. She had read the contract. She had burned the thing that needed burning, and held what needed holding. And she had sat in the library in December, and said the true thing aloud, and it had been met by something she had not expected, a man who had also been waiting, in his own colder way, to be known. If there is a satisfaction available to a woman who was told she was practical, and it is this: practical, wielded with care, turns out to mean something the people who used the word against her did not intend. It means deliberate. It means clear-eyed. It means she understood the document, and the room, and the person in the doorway, and what lay between the present and what the present might become. On a May evening, the windows opened to the street below, the first warm air of the year moving through the curtains. Frederick came to stand behind her at the pianoforte and rested his hands on her shoulders, lightly, in the specific way of someone who has decided, rather than concluded, to be present. She continued playing. He said nothing, because he did not need to. The music moved through the room, and the May light moved through the curtains, and somewhere in the house below, a door closed softly, and the evening arranged itself around them with the quiet authority of things that have been allowed to settle into their true form. The ash was gone. The clause remained. The contract it had once been part of was still, legally, everywhere it needed to be. And in the grate of the sitting room off the drawing room, where the pianoforte lived and the linen cover had been folded away into a cedar chest, the fire burned, as it had been burning all the long winter, patient and warm and sufficient. If Cecily's story moved you, leave a quiet word in the comments. We will be here again soon.